Welcome to my YouTube channel. Tonight, we journey back in time to one of history's most famous voyages, the journey of Christopher Columbus and the discovery of the Americas in 1492. Lay back, relax, and let your mind drift across the ocean waves as we explore the story that changed the course of history forever. If you enjoy relaxing and learning with me, don't forget to subscribe to my channel so you never miss another calming dive into the past. Now, let's begin our voyage together. Discovery of the Americas, 1492. Welcome to another long and gentle journey through history. Close your eyes, lay back, and let the weight of the day slowly drift away. You're here to relax, to listen, and to maybe learn something new along the way. Tonight, our story takes us back more than 5 centuries to the year 1492, a year that changed the world forever. This is the story of the so-called discovery of the Americas, when Christopher Columbus set sail westward into the unknown and stumbled upon lands that would reshape history. But before we board the ships, before we feel the creak of wooden planks underfoot and hear the waves crashing endlessly against the hull, let's step back. Let's take a moment to understand the world as it was before 1492. Europe, before the Great Voyage, the late 15th century, was a time of transformation. Europe was shaking off the long shadows of the Middle Ages. The feudal castles, knights, and crusades were slowly giving way to something new, an era of curiosity, science, trade, and ambition. The Renaissance had already begun to flourish in cities like Florence and Venice, where scholars, artists, and inventors were rediscovering the wisdom of ancient Greece and Rome. Paintings were more lifelike. Books were spreading thanks to the printing press, and the human spirit seemed eager to expand its horizons. But beyond the beauty of art and scholarship, there was also hunger. Not just hunger for food, but hunger for wealth, trade, and power. Spices, yes, simple spices were among the most valuable commodities in the world. Pepper, cinnamon, cloves, nutmeg. Things we sprinkle casually on food today were treasures worth fortunes in medieval Europe. They added flavor, preserved meat, and even held a mystical aura of medicine and luxury. These spices came from Faroe lands, India, China, and the islands of Southeast Asia. To get them, European merchants relied on trade routes that snaked across deserts and seas. Caravans trudged across the Silk Road. Ships braved the Indian Ocean, and middlemen, especially Arab and Venetian traders, made sure that by the time spices reached Europe, their prices were sky high. But then, something happened that shook the balance. In 1453, the great city of Constantinople fell to the Ottoman Turks. This was no small event. Constantinople had been the gateway between East and West for centuries, a hub of trade that connected Europe to Asia. When it fell, the old trade routes were disrupted, blocked, or controlled by powers unfriendly to European merchants. The prices of spices rose even higher. The hunger grew sharper. So European powers began to ask a daring question. Was there another way? Could there be a route that bypassed the overland networks entirely? If one could sail around Africa, perhaps the riches of India and Asia could be reached directly. Portugal was already trying. Sailors hugged the coast of Africa, inching further south with each voyage, slowly mapping the continent. They dreamed of reaching India by rounding the Cape of Good Hope. This was the safe, logical path. But there was another idea, a wilder one. What if, instead of sailing east to reach Asia, one sailed west? Enter Christopher Columbus. It is here that we first hear of a man named Cristoforo Colombo, or as we know him today, Christopher Columbus. Born in Genoa, Italy, around 1451, Columbus grew up by the sea. As a boy, he studied maps and charts, and he listened to tales of sailors who braved storms and returned with exotic treasures. He became obsessed with the idea that the world was smaller than most believed. If the earth was round, then surely Asia could be reached more quickly by sailing west. Most scholars of the time already knew the earth was round. This is a common myth, that people thought it was flat. The real question was about size. How far was Asia from Europe if you crossed the Atlantic? Columbus believed it wasn't very far at all. In truth, he underestimated the distance by thousands of miles. If the Americas hadn't been there, his crews would have perished in endless ocean. But Columbus was a dreamer, and dreamers don't let details stop them. He needed money, ships, and men to test his vision. He went to Portugal first, asking King John II to fund his voyage. The Portuguese experts examined his plans and rejected them. They thought his math was wrong and his idea too risky. Columbus tried again, this time in Spain. And it was here, after years of pleading and waiting, that fortune smiled on him. King Ferdinand and Queen Isabella, fresh from completing the Reconquista, the long campaign to drive the Moors from Spain, were ready to make their mark on the world. They agreed to back Columbus. The deal was set. He would have 3 ships, the Nina, the Pinta, and the Santa. He would set sail into the vast unknown, carrying not just hopes of wealth, but also the pride of a kingdom eager to expand its reach. And so, on the morning of August 3, 1492, from the port of Palos de la Frontera, Columbus and his crew left Europe behind. The waves stretched endlessly before them, and none of them knew what awaited beyond the horizon. The voyage and life at sea. The year was 1492. Columbus had finally won the support of Spain, and with 3 ships, the Nina, the Pinta, and the Santa, he prepared to set out into the great unknown. Picture the morning sun over the harbor at Palos de la Frontera. Families gathered on the docks, waving and shouting farewells. Some wept quietly, fearing they might never see their loved ones again. To sail west was not only daring, it was madness in the eyes of many. The Atlantic was a vast and dangerous sea, and no one truly knew what lay beyond. The 3 ships were not grand galleons, but rather modest vessels. De Santa Maria Columbus's flagship was the La Rista sturdy carack, with a broad hull. The Nina and the Pinta were smaller caravels, lighter and faster, with sails that could catch shifting winds. The crews were a mixture of sailors, adventurers, criminals seeking pardon, and desperate men looking for a chance at fortune. About 90 in total. Some were loyal, but many were skeptical of their commander's wild plan. Life aboard the ship's life on board was no easy matter. The ships were cramped, damp, and constantly swaying. The men slept on rough wooden planks or hammocks, packed together like cargo. Fresh water grew stale within weeks, food spoiled quickly, and the constant rocking of the sea made even simple tasks exhausting. Meals were plain and repetitive. Hard biscuits, salted meat, dried peas, and sometimes cheese or olives. Fresh fruit and vegetables were rare, and as the weeks dragged on, the risk of scurvy loomed though. Sailors of that time didn't yet understand the cause. The stench was overwhelming. The smell of sweat, unwashed bodies, and the mingling odors of livestock carried on board made the air heavy. Rats scurried in the shadows. Seasickness tormented many of the crew, especially during storms, when the ships pitched violently. And yet, amid the hardship, there were moments of quiet beauty. Nights on the Atlantic brought skies so full of stars that the men felt they were sailing under a glittering dome. The sound of waves against the hull and the creaking of the wooden masts became a rhythm of life. Some sailors whispered prayers, others told stories, and many stared silently at the horizon, wondering what fate awaited them. The uncertainty days turned into weeks. The farther west they sailed, the more restless the crew became. Each sunrise brought new fears. Was there truly land beyond this endless sea? Or would they sail until their supplies ran out, swallowed by the ocean? Columbus kept 2 sets of logs. In one, he recorded the true distance sailed. In the other, which he shared with the crew, he reported smaller numbers. He did this to keep them calm, to make them believe they had not ventured too far from home. But even with this deception, tension grew. Whispers of mutiny began to stir. Some men argued that they should turn back. Others said Columbus was leading them to their doom. Columbus, however, remained firm. He had an unshakable confidence, whether born of faith, stubbornness, or desperation, that land was near. He encouraged his men, promising rewards, titles, and wealth if they succeeded. He reminded them that great glory awaited those who dared. Signs of hope then. In early October, the mood began to shift. The sailors noticed bits of driftwood floating by, as if carried from distant shores. They spotted pieces of vegetation in the water, and even a carved stick, evidence that land could not be far away. Birds began to appear, seabirds that did not stray far from land. Each sign lifted spirits, renewing hope. Still, the men grew anxious. On October 9th, with tensions nearing a breaking point, Columbus made a promise. If they did not find land within 3 more days, they would turn back. The crew agreed, but in their hearts, many doubted. Then came the night of October 11th. The sea was calm, the air still, and anticipation heavy. The men strained their eyes in the darkness, scanning the horizon for anything, any glimpse of salvation. At around 2 a.m., a cry broke the silence. Rodrigo de Triana, a sailor aboard the Pinta, shouted, "Tierra! Land! Land!" Far in the distance, a faint shape was visible. After more than 2 months at sea, their journey had brought them to a new world. Landfall and first encounters, the morning of October 12, 1492, was unlike any other in the lives of Columbus and his crew. As the light of dawn spread across the horizon, the vague shadow seen in the night grew sharper. Palm trees, sandy beaches, and the faint green of vegetation came into view. After weeks of nothing but endless sea, the sight of land was overwhelming. Men wept openly. Some dropped to their knees in prayer, and others shouted with joy. Their gamble had not ended in despair, had brought them to something new. The ships carefully anchored near the island. Columbus, wearing his finest attire, took a small boat ashore, accompanied by armed men bearing the Spanish standard. When they stepped onto the sand, Columbus fell to his knees, kissed the earth, and gave thanks to God. He named the island San Salvador, Holy Savior. To Columbus, this was Asia. He believed he had reached the Indies, the islands of the East, so famed for spices and riches. He had no idea that he was standing on a completely different continent, entirely unknown world to Europeans. The people of the New World, but Columbus and his men were not alone. The island was home to a people we now know as the Ajazar, were part of a larger Arawak-speaking group, living across the islands of the Caribbean. They had brown skin, dark hair, and wore little clothing in the tropical climate. They decorated themselves with paint and feathers, and they carried spears tipped with sharpened wood or fish bones. When they saw the strange ships and the armored men coming ashore, they must have been filled with a mix of awe and curiosity. To them, the Spanish appeared as visitors from another world, perhaps even gods. Columbus described them as generous and friendly. They approached with gifts of parrots, cotton thread, and food. They showed no fear, only hospitality. In his journal, Columbus wrote of their kindness, their willingness to trade, and their innocence. But he also noted their lack of iron, weapons, and armor. To him, this meant they could easily be conquered. Misunderstandings and first impressions. They had no concept of Europe, of Spain, or of the vast ambitions that had carried these men across the sea. To them, the Spanish were strangers, perhaps temporary visitors. They could not have imagined that these first landings were the beginning of centuries of colonization, conquest, and dramatic change. Columbus, meanwhile, saw opportunity. He believed the land was rich, and he thought the people could be converted to Christianity and used as laborers. In his mind, this was not just discovery, was the opening of new lands for Spain, for the church, and for his own glory. The Spanish explored the island further, noting its fertile soil, fresh water, and lush vegetation. They marveled at fruits they had never seen, at birds of brilliant color, and at the beauty of the tropical landscape. To men used to the stone cities of Europe, the Caribbean seemed like paradise. The search continues. Though San Salvador was beautiful, Columbus wanted more. He was still searching for the riches of Asia, gold, spices, and silks, the totem of other islands nearby, larger and wealthier. Guided by their words, Columbus and his men set sail again, exploring what we now know as the Bahamas, Cuba, and Hispaniola. Everywhere they went, they encountered indigenous communities, with their own customs, languages, and traditions. Columbus often misunderstood them, interpreting what he saw through the lens of European expectations. When he found gold ornaments worn by he imagined vast mines waiting to be claimed. When he saw their villages, he imagined potential colonies. What to thee was home, to Columbus was treasure, a world forever changed. That first encounter on the sandy shores of San Salvador was more than just a meeting between two peoples. It was the beginning of a collision between worlds. For thousands of years, the Americas had been home to great civilizations, the Maya, the Aztec, the Inca, and countless others. They had their own cultures, histories, and achievements. Now, suddenly, they were drawn into the orbit of Europe, and nothing would ever be the same. Exploration of the islands and first settlements. After the excitement of first landfall, Columbus's ambitions only grew. San Salvador was beautiful, yes, but he was convinced greater riches lay elsewhere. To him, the sandy island was only a stepping stone toward the fabled wealth of Asia. So, leaving behind the communities who had welcomed them, the Spanish fleet pressed onward into the Caribbean Sea, sailing further west. Guided by stories from the indigenous islanders, Columbus sailed westward. Soon, on October 28, 1492, he reached the shores of a vast island that he believed was the coast of Asia itself. This was Cuba. The land stretched wide before him, covered in lush forests and fertile valleys. The rivers ran fresh and clear, the air smelled of flowers, and birds filled the sky. Columbus was enchanted. He described Cuba as the most beautiful land human eyes had ever seen. Once again, the people he encountered were welcoming. They lived in small villages, growing crops like maize, cassava, and sweet potatoes. They smoked dried leaves, something Columbus noted with curiosity, though at the time, he could not have imagined the global future of tobacco. But despite the beauty, Columbus's mind remained fixed on gold. He constantly asked about where it might be found. Whenever he saw a golden ornament or a small nugget worn by a villager, he took it as proof of hidden mines somewhere inland. The locals, perhaps misunderstanding his questions, always pointed further on toward other islands. And so Columbus kept chasing the promise of riches. Arrival in Hispaniola in early December 1492, the fleet reached another large island. Columbus named it La Hispaniola, today divided between Haiti and the Dominican Republic. Here, the land was even more promising. Rolling hills, fertile fields, rivers, and forests seemed perfect for settlement. The indigenous population was numerous, and Columbus immediately saw the potential for Spanish colonies to thrive. But fate soon tested him. On Christmas Eve, disaster struck. The Santa Maria, Columbus's flagship, ran aground on a reef and broke apart. The ship was lost. Rather than despair, Columbus saw an opportunity. With the wreckage of the ship, he ordered the building of a small fort. He called it La Navidad, the Nativity. Since the shipwreck had happened on Christmas Day, this was the first European settlement in the New World. Fort La Navidad was left under the command of a garrison of 39 men. Columbus promised he would return with supplies and more settlers. With that, the seeds of colonization were planted. The return journey begins by January 1493. Columbus knew it was time to return to Spain. His mission was not just exploration. He had to prove success to Ferdinand and Isabella. He had to bring back evidence of new lands, of potential wealth, and of souls ready for conversion to Christianity. The ships, now reduced to 2, were loaded with samples of what they had found. Exotic parrots, fruits, and plants were taken aboard. A small number of people were also brought, some willingly, others not, to serve as proof of the new peoples discovered. Columbus left Hispaniola behind, but his thoughts lingered. He believed he had skirted the edges of Asia, and that even greater riches awaited further exploration. Storms and near disaster, the return voyage was not easy. In February 1493, the fleet was caught in violent storms. As it neared Europe, the Nina and the Pinta were separated, tossed helplessly by furious winds and waves. For a time, Columbus feared all would be lost. In his desperation, he wrote a detailed account of the voyage, his discovery of islands, his meetings with indigenous peoples, his hopes for future riches. He sealed the letter in a barrel and cast it into the sea, hoping it might survive even if he did not. But fortune spared him. After weeks of hardship, Columbus finally sighted land once again, not Spain, but Portugal. He was received cautiously by the Portuguese king, who eyed the discovery with suspicion, knowing it might threaten Portugal's own ambitions of exploration. By March 1493, Columbus at last returned to Spain. He was no longer a simple mariner begging for ships. He was a man who had returned from the unknown, bringing news of lands beyond imagination. The hero's welcome in Spain, word spread like wildfire. Bells rang, crowds gathered, and Columbus was celebrated as a hero. He was paraded through the streets, bringing with him indigenous captives, exotic birds, and treasures that dazzled the Spanish court. Ferdinand and Isabella were overjoyed. Their gamble had paid off beyond belief. Columbus promised them more land, more wealth, more glory. Already, plans were drawn for another voyage, larger and more ambitious than the first. What had begun as one man's dream had become the opening chapter in a story that would reshape two continents. The second voyage and the Columbian exchange, Columbus's return to Spain in 1493, had made him a hero. He had promised the Spanish crown, new lands, new subjects, and untold wealth. Ferdinand and Isabella, still basking in the triumph of the Reconquista, saw in him the perfect chance to expand their empire across the seas. They wasted no time. A second voyage was approved, far larger and better supplied than the first. This was no longer a gamble, with 3 small ships and fewer than 100 men. Now, Spain committed fully. A fleet of colonization in September of 1493, Columbus set out once more. This time, he commanded a fleet of 17 ships, carrying over 1,200 men. Among them were not only sailors, but priests, craftsmen, soldiers, and settlers. Horses, cattle, pigs, and seeds of European crops were loaded aboard. This was not simply an expedition of discovery, it was the beginning of colonization. Spain intended to plant its flag firmly in the New World. The fleet sailed across the Atlantic with more confidence than before, following the route Columbus had charted. By late November, they reached the Caribbean once again. Columbus and his men landed on several islands, including Dominica, Guadalupe, and Puerto Rico. The tragedy at La Navidad, but Columbus's mind was fixed on Hispaniola, where he had left behind a garrison at Fort La Navidad. He expected to find his men thriving, waiting proudly for his return. Instead, what he found shocked him. La Navidad had been destroyed. The fort was burned, and the men were dead. Conflict had erupted between the Spanish and the people. Some of Columbus's men had abused the locals, taking women and gold by force. They had retaliated, and the small outpost was wiped out. This grim discovery revealed that relations between the Europeans and the indigenous peoples would not remain peaceful. Distrust, violence, and misunderstanding had already taken root. Building a colony, despite this tragedy, Columbus pushed forward. On the northern coast of Hispaniola, he founded a new settlement, La Isabela, built in 1494. It became the first official town in the Americas, founded by Europeans. Here, the Spanish tried to establish a foothold. They built houses, a church, and even attempted to mine for gold. But life was harsh. The settlers were unaccustomed to the tropical climate. Food was scarce, disease spread quickly, and conflicts with the people deepened. Still, the presence of horses, cattle, and European crops marked the beginning of something monumental: the blending of two worlds. The Columbian Exchange begins, though Columbus did not fully realize it at the time. His voyages had set into motion what historians now call the Columbian Exchange, the vast transfer of plants, animals, people, and diseases between the Old World and the New. From Europe, ships carried horses, cattle, pigs, sheep, wheat, sugarcane, and grapes across the Atlantic. These transformed the landscapes and economies of the Americas. Horses, in particular, revolutionized indigenous life on the mainland, giving mobility and power to tribes who adopted them. From the Americas, new foods made their way to Europe. Crops that would become staples across the world: maize, corn, potatoes, tomatoes, cacao, and chili peppers all came from the New World. Imagine Italian cuisine without tomatoes, or Irish life without potatoes. The Columbian Exchange reshaped diets everywhere. But there was a darker side. Along with goods came diseases: smallpox, measles, and influenza illnesses, long present in Europe but unknown in the Americas, spread rapidly among indigenous peoples who had no immunity. The results were devastating. Entire communities were wiped out. Populations that had thrived for centuries declined catastrophically within decades of contact. This was one of the most tragic consequences of the encounter between worlds. Columbus's challenges. Columbus himself struggled as governor of the new colonies. He faced resistance not only from the indigenous peoples, but also from his own men. Settlers complained about harsh conditions, lack of gold, and Columbus's leadership. The dream of instant wealth had not matched the reality of survival in a foreign land. Yet, despite these challenges, Spain remained committed. More voyages would follow, more settlers would arrive, and the Caribbean would become the first stepping stone to a vast empire. A new era. The second voyage marked a turning point. What began as exploration had now become colonization. Europe and the Americas were no longer separate worlds. They were becoming one, linked by trade, conquest, and exchange. The consequences were immense. For Europe, it meant new wealth, new opportunities, and new ambitions. For the indigenous peoples of the Americas, it meant upheaval, loss, and the beginning of a struggle for survival. The world, after 1493, would never again be the same. The legacy of Columbus and the expansion of European exploration. The story of Columbus did not end with his triumphant return from the second voyage. In fact, his life would be marked by a series of further journeys, rising fame, and eventual controversy. But more importantly, his voyages opened the floodgates for Europe's age of exploration in the Americas. Columbus's later voyages. Columbus would make 4 voyages across the Atlantic between 1492 and 1504. Each brought him deeper into the Caribbean and along the coasts of Central and South America. On his 3rd voyage in 1498, Columbus reached the mainland of South America, near present-day Venezuela. For the first time, he set foot on continental soil, though he still believed he was skirting the edges of Asia. His 4th and final voyage in 1502 took him along the coasts of Central America, Honduras, Nicaragua, Costa Rica, and Panama. Columbus searched desperately for a strait that would lead to Asia, a western passage to the riches he still dreamed of. But no such passage was found. Though Columbus had expanded Europe's knowledge of the Atlantic world, his dreams of finding Asia never came true. A decline in fortune, despite his fame as the Admiral of the Ocean Sea. Columbus's later years were troubled. His leadership in the colonies was criticized, both by settlers who found life harsh and by the Spanish crown, which began to hear reports of mismanagement and cruelty. Accusations of corruption and brutality reached Ferdinand and Isabella. In 1500, Columbus was arrested and returned to Spain in chains. Though he was eventually released and pardoned, his reputation had been stained. He never regained the full trust of the crown. When he died in 1506, Columbus still believed he had reached the outskirts of Asia. He never truly understood that he had encountered a vast, entirely new continent. The magnitude of his discovery would only be grasped in the years after his death. A wave of exploration, while Columbus's personal fortunes declined. The impact of his voyages was unstoppable. News of new lands across the Atlantic spread rapidly throughout Europe. The promise of gold, fertile soil, and untapped riches was irresistible. Spain quickly sent more expeditions. In 1500, the navigator, the Sentai Vicente, who had sailed with Columbus, reached the coast of Brazil. A few years later, Amerigo Vespucci, an Italian explorer sailing for Spain and later Portugal, traveled extensively along the South American coast. His letters describing the New World were widely published, and it was his name, not Columbus's, that became attached to the continent's America. Portugal, too, expanded its influence, already pushing down the African coast and around to India. Portuguese explorers ventured into South America. The Treaty of Tordesillas, signed in 1494, divided the world between Spain and Portugal, an agreement blessed by the Pope. This gave Spain control of most of the Americas, while Portugal claimed Brazil and territories in Africa and Asia. Soon, other nations joined the race. The English, French, and Dutch, though slower to start, would eventually challenge Spain and Portugal for dominance in the New World. The transformation of Europe. The impact on Europe itself was profound. Ships returned from the Americas carrying gold and silver, flooding Spanish coffers and fueling the rise of Spain as the most powerful empire of the 16th century. New crops such as maize, potatoes, and tomatoes began to spread across Europe, gradually transforming agriculture and diets. But with wealth came rivalry. Wars were fought not only on European soil, but also across the oceans. The discovery of the Americas had turned the Atlantic from a distant frontier into the new center of global power. The transformation of the Americas for the indigenous peoples, the consequences were tragic and irreversible. Diseases carried unknowingly by Europeans spread with devastating speed. Smallpox, measles, and influenza decimated communities, often killing entire villages within weeks. Populations that had thrived for centuries collapsed within a generation. Alongside disease came conquest. Spanish expeditions soon reached the mighty civilizations of the Americasta, Aztec Empire in Mexico, and the Inca Empire in Peru. Armed with steel weapons, horses, and firearms, the Spanish overwhelmed these empires, seizing their wealth and enslaving their peoples. What Columbus had begun as an uncertain voyage in 1492 had become, within decades, a sweeping wave of conquest and colonization that reshaped the Americas forever. A divided legacy. Columbus's legacy remains complex. To Spain, he was celebrated as a national hero who expanded the empire. To much of Europe, he symbolized the daring spirit of exploration. But for indigenous peoples, his arrival marked the beginning of centuries of suffering, dispossession, and cultural destruction. Today, historians recognize both sides of the legacy. The voyage of 1492 was a turning point in world history, connecting continents that had been separated for millennia. It was the start of globalization, of cultural exchange, and of modern history as we know it. Yet it also unleashed waves of violence and exploitation, whose effects are still felt today. The great civilizations of the Americas before contact. When Columbus set foot in the Caribbean, he believed he had stumbled upon islands on the edge of Asia. What he did not know was that he had entered a world already rich with history, culture, and complexity. Far from being an untouched wilderness, the Americas were home to vast civilizations, sophisticated cities, and millions of people whose societies had thrived for centuries. The scale of pre-Columbian America. Before 1492, the population of the Americas is estimated to have been anywhere from 40 to 60 million people. They lived in diverse environments, from the icy tundra of the Arctic, to the deserts of the American Southwest, to the lush jungles of Central and South America. Some lived in small, nomadic groups. Others built great empires with advanced political, religious, and economic systems. The arrival of Europeans would eventually reshape and destroy much of this world. But in 1492, these civilizations stood at the height of their power. The Maya, masters of astronomy and writing long before Columbus, the Maya civilization had flourished in Central America. Though their great cities had declined by 900 CE, Maya culture and people still lived across the peninsula and Guatemala at the time of European contact. The Maya were renowned for astronomy and calendars. They developed a calendar system more accurate than the one used in Europe. Priests could predict solar eclipses and track planetary movements with astonishing precision. Writing system. The Maya were the only people in the Americas to develop a full written script. They carved inscriptions into stone temples and recorded histories in codices made of bark paper. Cities and architecture. Their cities, like Tikal and Chichen, were filled with soaring pyramids, palaces, and ball courts where ritual games were played. Though weakened by internal conflict, the Maya world was still vibrant in 1492, and their knowledge remained woven into Mesoamerican culture. The Aztec Empire, the jewel of Mexico. At the very moment Columbus was landing in the Caribbean, the Aztec Empire was reaching its peak in central Mexico. Capital city of built on an island in Lake Texcoco, it dazzled visitors. With causeways, canals, floating gardens, markets, and temples, it rivaled the great cities of Europe. Estimates suggest a population of 200,000 to 300,000, larger than many European capitals at the time. Trade and tribute. The Aztecs controlled a vast empire through conquest and tribute, demanding goods such as maize, cacao, cotton, and obsidian, religion and sacrifice. The Aztecs believed in many gods, with the sun god at the center of their faith. Human sacrifice played a crucial role in their rituals, intended to nourish the gods and maintain cosmic balance. The Aztec Empire was militarily powerful, economically wealthy, and culturally dynamic, yet also deeply vulnerable to internal unrest and the shock of European arrival. The Inca Empire, lords of the Andes in South America. The Inca Empire stretched across the Andes Mountains, ruling over a territory of some 2,500 miles from modern-day Ecuador through Peru, Bolivia, Chile, and Argentina. Engineering marvels. The Incas built roads, bridges, and terraces that wound through the treacherous Andean mountains. Their road network rivaled that of ancient Rome. Cusco and Machu Picchu. Cusco served as the capital, a dazzling city with stone palaces and temples. High in the mountains, Machu Picchu stood as a royal retreat, blending breathtaking scenery with masterful stonework, economy, and control. The empire managed resources through a system of communal labor called mita, where subjects contributed labor to state projects. Instead of money, they used goods and services as currency. Religion. Worship centered on the sun god, into festivals and ceremonies tied agricultural life to the spiritual order. The Inca maintained unity over diverse peoples and harsh geography. But their centralized system made them especially vulnerable once European invaders disrupted the balance. The Mississippian cultures. Cities of North America. While the great empires of Mesoamerica and the Andes often capture attention, North America was also home to remarkable societies. Cahokia, near present-day St. Louis. Cahokia was a massive city of earthen mounds and plazas, flourishing between 1050 and 1350. Though it had declined by Columbus's time, its legacy influenced later cultures. Iroquois Confederacy. In the Northeast, the Iroquois created a sophisticated political alliance that would endure for centuries. Their system of councils and decision-making impressed later European observers and even influenced democratic ideas. Plains and Pueblo cultures. On the Great Plains, nomadic peoples thrived as hunters and traders, while in the Southwest, the Pueblo built intricate adobe dwellings, such as those at Mesa Verde, a world on the eve of contact in 1492. The Americas were not a new world, but a living mosaic of cultures, languages, and societies. From the bustling markets up to the sacred temples of Cusco, to the quiet villages of the Iroquois, life was rich, diverse, and deeply rooted in the land. The arrival of Europeans would bring shockwaves. Disease, conquest, and colonization would shatter many of these civilizations. But to understand the true impact of 1492, it is essential to see the world that existed before one, filled with creativity, innovation, and resilience. The Clash of Worlds. First encounters when Columbus and his crew first stepped onto the beaches of the Caribbean islands in October 1492. They entered into a human encounter that was both ordinary and extraordinary. Ordinary in the sense that people have always met strangers. Extraordinary in the sense that this was the first meeting of two hemispheres, a collision that would forever reshape global history. The first people Columbus met were an indigenous group who inhabited the islands of the Caribbean. They lived across modern-day Bahamas, Cuba, Hispaniola today, Haiti and the Dominican Republic, Jamaica, and Puerto Rico. Appearance and dress. Columbus described them as tall, strong, and well-proportioned. They wore little clothing in the tropical climate, adorning themselves with feathers, paint, and small ornaments. Society, life. They lived in villages ruled by chiefs, caciques. They grew crops such as cassava, maize, beans, and sweet potatoes, and they were skilled fishermen and artisans. Beliefs and spirits. Their spiritual life centered around Zimis, sacred figures representing deities. Ancestors. or natural forces. To the strange, bearded men arriving in huge floating wooden houses were bewildering. To Columbus, these islanders seemed both innocent and vulnerable, easy to convert to Christianity and, in his eyes, easy to rule. First impressions. Curiosity and misunderstanding. The encounters were filled with curiosity. Columbus wrote in his journal that they were generous, offering food, parrots, cotton, and ornaments in exchange for small trinkets like beads and bells. But beneath the surface, misunderstandings ran deep. The gift giving was part of a system of reciprocity and respect. To Columbus, these exchanges symbolized subordination. He believed the islanders were acknowledging Spanish superiority. From the very first contact, there was a gap in meaning that would only widen with time. Technology shocked the meeting, also exposed profound differences in technology and worldview. Ships and weapons. The Spanish carried steel swords, crossbows, and guns, objects utterly unfamiliar to the islanders. Columbus noted how easily his men could intimidate them with displays of weaponry. Navigation. To the Spanish ships seemed like supernatural monsters. To the Europeans, they were simply tools of empire. Gold. When Columbus saw that the islanders wore small ornaments of gold, he became obsessed. For him and for Spain, gold was wealth, power, and divine favor. For the gold had little practical value, was just another material for decoration. This difference in values foreshadowed centuries of exploitation, conversion, and control. Almost immediately, Columbus saw them not just as new neighbors, but as potential subjects. He believed they could be converted to Christianity, enslaved to serve Spain. In his letters, Columbus described them as gentle and without arms, writing that they would make fine servants. From the very start, his vision was less about coexistence and more about domination, the exchange of worlds. While Columbus dreamed of conquest, the reality of contact was more complex. Both sides began to exchange not just goods, but knowledge, foods, and ideas. From Europe to the Americas, horses, cattle, pigs, sheep, wheat, sugarcane, and Christianity. From the Americas to Europe, maize, potatoes, tomatoes, cacao, tobacco, and new cultural practices. This Columbian exchange, as historians later called it, would alter diets, economies, and societies across the world. But in 1492, it began with small moments, sharing food, exchanging gifts, and trying to interpret one another's gestures. The shadow of violence, yet, beneath the curiosity and wonder, violence was never far away. Columbus ordered his men to take captives, both as guides and as proof for the Spanish court. Some resisted, others welcomed the newcomers, hoping to form alliances. These first skirmishes hinted at what was to come: the decimation of indigenous populations through disease, forced labor, and war. Two worlds face to face. Imagine that moment in late 1492. On one side, sailors from Spain, weary after weeks at sea, carrying crosses, swords, and royal flags. On the other, islanders who had lived in their lands for generations, offering food, songs, and gifts. Neither side could truly comprehend what the other represented. For the Europeans, this was the beginning of a new age of empire. For the indigenous peoples, it was the beginning of a struggle for survival, a collision that could not be unmade. The encounter between Columbus and the was not just a meeting, it was the spark of a chain reaction. Cultures collided, economies intertwined, diseases spread, faiths confronted one another. The discovery of the Americas was, in truth, the beginning of the creation of a new world, not one that replaced the old, but one that emerged from conflict, exchange, and transformation. The voyage home, after months exploring the Caribbean islands, Columbus prepared to return to Spain in January 1493. Ships, he had lost the Santa to a wreck near Hispaniola, so only the Nina and Pinta sailed back. Crew, he left behind a small garrison of men in a settlement he called La Navidad, built from the wreckage of the Santa. These men were to establish a Spanish presence while Columbus reported his discoveries to the crown. The return voyage was treacherous. Columbus's ships were battered by storms, and at one point he feared he might never make it home. In desperation, he wrote an account of his discoveries, sealed it in a barrel, and threw it into the sea, hoping someone would one day find it if he perished. By March 1493, Columbus safely reached Spain, exhausted but triumphant. Europe reacts. The reaction in Spain and across Europe was electric. The Spanish crown, Ferdinand and Isabella, were delighted. They saw Columbus's discovery as the fulfillment of a divine mission. God had rewarded their faith with new lands and opportunities for wealth. The public word spread quickly. Pamphlets and letters described exotic islands, Indians, and hints of gold. For ordinary Europeans, this was a story of adventure, mystery, and hope. Rivals. Portugal, Spain's maritime rival, reacted with suspicion. The Portuguese had long claimed dominance over Atlantic exploration, and Columbus's discoveries threatened their monopoly. This led to diplomatic tension. Who exactly had the right to claim the newly found lands? The Papal Bulls and the Treaty of Tordesillas. To resolve the conflict between Spain and Portugal, the Pope intervened. In 1493, Pope Alexander VI issued a series of papal bulls, edicts granting Spain rights to newly discovered lands west of a certain line in the Atlantic. Portugal objected, and negotiations followed. In 1494, the Treaty of Tordesillas was signed, dividing the non-European world into two spheres of influence. Spain would control lands to the west. Portugal would control lands to the east. This treaty shaped centuries of colonization. It explains why Brazil, east of the line, became Portuguese, while most of the rest of the Americas fell under Spanish rule. Columbus becomes a hero back in Spain. Columbus was celebrated as a hero. He rode into Barcelona in a grand procession, bringing with him indigenous captives, parrots, gold trinkets, and other exotic items. The royal court received him with honors, granting him the titles promised in his contract: Admiral of the Ocean Sea and Viceroy of the Indies. For a brief moment, Columbus stood at the height of fame, an explorer who had not only achieved the impossible, but opened the door to untold riches. A new age of exploration begins. Columbus's return set off a chain reaction across Europe. Spain quickly organized a second voyage in 1493, far larger than the first. Instead of 3 small ships, Columbus led 17 vessels and over 1,000 men. This was no longer just an expedition, it was the beginning of colonization. Other nations, Portugal, England, and France, watched closely. Within decades, they too launched expeditions, unwilling to let Spain dominate the New World alone. Merchants and investors. The promise of wealth from trade, gold, and land inspired financial backers across Europe. The age of discovery was now unstoppable. For the indigenous peoples, while Europe celebrated, the reality for the indigenous peoples of the Americas was far more grim. The men Columbus left at La Navidad soon clashed with the exploiting and abusing them. Early reports show growing tensions, foreshadowing violence, disease, and enslavement that would devastate indigenous societies. What began as an exchange of gifts and curiosity was already sliding into conquest and domination. The discovery for Spain was the beginning of dispossession for the native peoples. A shift in world history. Columbus's return to Spain in 1493 marked more than just a personal victory. It was the start of a profound shift in world history. The Atlantic Ocean became the new center of global trade and exploration. Empires began to expand, not just within Europe, but across continents. Two worlds separated for millennia were now permanently linked, for better and for worse. The story of Columbus's first voyage ended with celebration in Europe. But for the Americas, It was the beginning of centuries of upheaval. The legacy of 1492. A world transformed the Columbian Exchange. Perhaps the most important long-term result of Columbus's voyage was the Columbian Exchange, the vast transfer of plants, animals, people, and diseases between the Old World, Europe, Africa, Asia, and the New World, the Americas. To Europe, potatoes, maize, corn, tomatoes, cacao, chocolate, tobacco, and chili peppers. These foods revolutionized European diets, supported population growth, and became staples worldwide. To the Americas, horses, cattle, pigs, sheep, and wheat. These animals and crops transformed indigenous lifestyles, economies, and environments. Horses, in particular, reshaped native cultures in North America. Diseases. Europeans brought smallpox, measles, and influenza diseases to which Native Americans had no immunity. Epidemics devastated indigenous populations, with mortality rates as high as 80 to 90% in some areas. This exchange was both a bridge and a catastrophe, uniting the world while unleashing destruction. A new age of empires. 1492 opened the floodgates for European expansion. Spain became the first true global empire, stretching across the Americas, Asia, the Philippines, and parts of Europe. Silver from the Americas fueled Spain's wealth and power. Portugal consolidated its empire in Brazil, Africa, and Asia, dominating trade routes. England and France, inspired by Columbus, they too began exploring. Within a century, they were colonizing North America and the Caribbean. The Americas became the arena of imperial rivalry, shaping global politics for centuries. The birth of the Atlantic world. Columbus's voyage shifted the center of gravity from the Mediterranean to the Atlantic Ocean. Trade, migration, and warfare increasingly revolved around the Atlantic. New shipping routes connected Europe, Africa, and the Americas in a triangle of commerce. Europe exported goods and weapons. Africa supplied enslaved people in the brutal transatlantic slave trade. The Americas provided raw materials like sugar, cotton, tobacco, and silver. This system fueled European wealth while brutally exploiting millions of Africans and indigenous peoples, a turning point for indigenous civilizations for Native Americans. The discovery was not a beginning, but the start of profound upheaval. Population collapse. Diseases wiped out vast communities. Cultural erosion, forced conversions, missions, and colonial rule suppressed indigenous traditions. Resistance and survival. Despite the devastation, indigenous peoples adapted, resisted, and preserved their identities. Even today, native cultures endure and reclaim their histories. 1492 was thus both a tragedy and a testimony to survival. Columbus, hero or villain? Columbus himself remains one of the most controversial figures in history. Heroic view. For centuries, he was celebrated as the brave explorer who discovered a new world and ushered in the modern age. Critical view. Modern perspectives emphasize the violence, enslavement, and exploitation that accompanied his voyages. His rule in Hispaniola was marked by brutality against a people. The truth is complex. Columbus was not the sole discoverer. Millions already lived in the Americas, and others like the Norse had visited earlier. But his voyage did mark the moment when two worlds collided permanently. The global legacy. Columbus's voyage set into motion forces that shape the world we live in today. The spread of foods, animals, and ideas across continents. The rise of global empires and modern capitalism. The tragic exploitation of indigenous peoples and the African diaspora. The blending of cultures that created entirely new identities in the Americas. In short, 1492 was the spark of globalization. Closing reflection. When Columbus set sail in 1492, neither he nor his crew could have imagined the magnitude of what they were starting. A gamble for spices and gold turned into a turning point for all humanity. For Europe, it meant wealth, power, and expansion. For the Americas, it meant colonization, loss, and transformation. For the world, it meant a future of interconnected continents, for better and worse. Today, we can see 1492 not just as a date, but as a doorway, the moment when the old world and new world became one.